Question number 1. How is power expressed in the age of globalism? In the contemporary age of globalism, the concept of power has undergone profound transformations, challenging traditional definitions that defined power around possessions of territory and resources, population, and military capabilities, as is articulated in the article by Nye. This shift in how power is expressed is driven by a complex interplay of economic interdependence, transnational actors, technological advancements, and an evolving political landscape, where outlined in Nye's analysis of the 5 key trends, traditional definitions of power no longer suffice, meaning that they are no longer as important. And one key change that we can observe is the rise of soft power alongside traditional hard power. Hard power is the military, hard power is economic, whereas soft power is the ability to change the way people think or influence the decisions of people. Even though hard power, such as military power, is still important today, economic influence and non material factors, such as cultural appeal and diplomatic persuasion, are increasingly important in shaping global dynamics. Nye mentions that hegemonic power is not solely about coercion, but also about the ability to attract and influence through shared norms and values. This is one of the most important sentences to include in the exam, and it's basically that power is expressed in the age of globalism in 2 ways. First, the manipulation of material incentives, and second, the socialization process. There are 2 basic ways in which hegemonic nations can exercise power. The first one is by manipulating economic incentives, whether through promises of rewards or of threats of punishment, to influence the policies and behaviors of secondary nations. This economic leverage not only dictates economic outcomes, but also shapes political decisions conducive to the hegemonic order. The second way hegemonic nations can exercise power is through socialization, where the norms and value orientations of leaders in secondary states are altered or changed to align more closely with those of the dominant state or the hegemonic state. This process involves the internalization of hegemonic norms and ideologies by foreign elites, where learning takes place as well as a convergence of these beliefs that reinforces the hegemon's vision of a global order. In other words, one country or one state adopts the beliefs of another. This socialization often follows periods of conflict or political upheaval. This could be wars, where dominant powers or hegemonic powers actively shape the post crisis narrative to promote their influence. Through this process of socialization, norms and values eventually change to reflect those of the dominant or hegemonic power or state. Moreover, the asymmetry or inequality of power distribution in global affairs is highlighted by economic and ideological disparities or differences. More privileged nations with superior economic resources and ideological leverage exert disproportionate influence over international norms and institutions. In other words, they have more power and say in things. In their texts, Farrell and Newman highlight how these power imbalances actually perpetuate or they keep alive structural inequalities among states, in that they reinforce the dominance of hegemonic powers or those that are in power with the global economic network. In other words, those who serve as nodes in the global economic network can gain information and control state hubs to create power due to their dominant status. They have the strongest say in things and they can control other states. Again, this is an important part of the question. In conclusion, power in the age of globalism transcends or goes beyond traditional definitions of hard power that are based solely on military and territorial strength, but rather it encompasses an interplay of economic, cultural, and ideological factors, where soft power and socialization play increasingly important roles. In other words, hegemonic powers, or those states that are in power, display their influence not only through economic manipulation, such as control over raw materials and markets, but also by shaping the beliefs and values of international leaders and universal norms. This dynamic highlights the evolving nature of power in a globalized world, where the ability to shape narratives and norms is just as important as traditional measures of strength, such as military. In conclusion, as the global landscape continues to evolve or change, power and the definition of power is changing as well. And it is important or crucial to understand these dynamics in order to navigate through the complexities of international relations in the 21st century. Okay, so just to recap over everything that we've spoken about, it's important to take into consideration that traditional ways of defining power are no longer enough. We live in a constantly globalized world where we're all interconnected. So, traditional ways of power or of having power, obtaining power, were defined usually in terms of hard power, which is being able to manipulate powers in other countries based on economic aspects or on military aspects, or who was more afraid of who, and this has changed over time. And this is mainly due to the fact that countries are more interconnected economically, and they're more transnational actors, meaning that there are people who represent the entire world, not only different countries. It's also because of technological advancements, because in a way we're all more connected now, and the political landscapes are evolving. They're not the same as they were in the 1800s. And then these traditional powers, they really aren't enough. Um, so how is it changing? Before it was all based on hard power, and now soft power is becoming more important. And this is basically economic influence and non-material factors such as cultural appeal. I mean, for example, something that can represent everyone culturally around the world, and diplomatic persuasions. They're also more important. Um, and Nine mentions that it's not only about being able to coerce or force someone into believing something or acting a certain way, but it's also about the ability to influence the way they think through norms and values and this kind of situation. So, out of the whole question, the most important part to remember is that power is expressed through two ways: through material incentives and socialization. Basically, economic incentives or material incentives is promises of rewards or threats of punishment to influence the policies and behaviors of secondary nations. So let's say I'll give you this if you follow the ways that I think, or if you agree with what I say, or oh, I won't give you this. I'll put a ban on trade with you if you don't think the way I think or adopt the things that I'm saying. And this economic leverage not only dictates economic outcomes, but it also shapes the political decisions of other countries to be aligned with those of the hegemonic countries or of those in power. The second way is through socialization, and socialization basically means the norms and values of leaders in secondary states or states that are not in power at the moment or considered hegemonic powers, and that people who are in charge of those states, they align the ideologies of those living in the states to be more closely related with those of the dominant state. So, for example, I'm from a dominant state, and I say everybody has to drive a car, And in the non-dominant state, people drive boats. But the president or the political power of that country says, hey, everyone needs to start driving cars because the hegemonic power is saying that we need to drive cars. So this process eh, involves the internalization of hegemonic norms and ideologies by foreign elite, as I mentioned the example, and it often occurs as a result of political upheaval or conflict. So, let's say there's a war, and Africa won. So Africa has a lot of power for the next few years on what it can say to other countries and how people should follow what Africa has to say and why, because they're in power. And through this process of socialization, the norms and the values eventually change to reflect the dominant state, as I mentioned. There's also something very important to note that there is a big asymmetry or disproportion between countries in global affairs in terms of economic and ideological disparities, sorry. Privileged nations with superior economic resources and ideologies, they exert influence over institutional norms and institutions, so they have more power over what everybody thinks worldwide. There is a text by Farrell and Newman that highlights that these power imbalances among countries around the world, it actually perpetuates structural inequalities among states, reinforcing the dominance of hegemonic powers within the global economic network. So the fact that there's one dominant state or one state that has more power, it's actually unfair because then they can decide what goes on all around the world. And those who serve as nodes in the global economic network can gain information and control over those as hubs to create more power due to their dominant state. So, for example, they can create a law that says everybody has to listen to Africa because I'm powerful, and that's a new law. And they can actually do that because they are in power, whereas a country that is not in power, let's say, for example, India, I mean, that's a bad example, but India, not Africa, who won the war, they don't really have a say in what the entire world can do per se because they don't have that control power. So basically, in conclusion, in the age of globalism, power has changed. It has changed from traditional means of military and coercion and hard power to other more soft power, the ability to influence, the ability to establish norms and values around the world, the ability to make people think what you think without having to stick a knife in them and say, I will kill you if you don't do it. And this encompasses basically an interplay of economic, obviously, I mean, money's always a factor, cultural and ideological factors where soft power and socialization play increasingly important roles. Hegemonic powers display influence not only through economic manipulation, such as control over raw materials and markets, but also by shaping the beliefs and values of international leaders. As I mentioned, money is still important. So, I mean, obviously, people still manipulate countries over raw materials and markets, but they also manipulate countries through their beliefs and values of international leaders and universal norms. This dynamic highlights the evolving nature of power, or how power has shifted throughout the years. And we realize that the ability to shape narratives or the way people think and norms is just as important as traditional and military power. And as this global landscape continues to change, it's very important that these dynamics are understood in order to navigate how power is changing throughout the times and how power is represented in international relations in the 21st century.